On April 15, 1912, when the RMS Titanic slipped beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic, it took 1,017 souls with it. Among them was Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, a man who had walked the decks that final night, calmly directing passengers to lifeboats, knowing his creation was doomed. But what the official records never mentioned, what Andrews himself had kept locked away in private journals, discovered decades later by his granddaughter in a sealed trunk in County Down, was that he should have died 14 years earlier. In the spring of 1898, a young black boy named Joseph Harper pulled Andrews from the freezing waters of Belfast Lough after a shipyard accident that was quietly buried by Harland and Wolff. The company paid the boy's family a modest sum, £50, the equivalent of 6 months' wages for a skilled worker, and arranged for Joseph to work aboard their ships when he came of age, a reward that would eventually place him on the Titanic's maiden voyage. 2 lives, bound by a single act of courage in cold water, meeting the same fate in the same cold water 14 years later. The question that haunted Andrews' surviving family for generations, the question that appeared in his final journal entry the night before the iceberg, was simple and devastating. Did the architect remember the boy who saved him when they both went down together? And if he did remember, why didn't he save him in return? Before we continue with the story of Joseph Harper and Thomas Andrews, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, which state or city are you listening from right now? I love knowing where our community is watching from. Now let's go back to where this all began, in the shipyards of Belfast, 1898. Where a boy who couldn't swim would jump into freezing water to save a stranger's life. The spring of 1898 arrived cold and unforgiving in Belfast, Northern Ireland. The city's skyline was dominated by the towering cranes of Harland and Wolff shipyard, massive iron structures that rose like skeletal giants against the grey sky, their arms reaching out over the water as if grasping for something just beyond their reach. The clang of hammers against steel echoed from dawn until well past dusk, a rhythmic percussion that became the heartbeat of the city. This was the heart of the British Empire's shipbuilding industry, where vessels of unprecedented size and ambition were taking shape, where men spoke in measurements and tonnage, where fortunes were made and lives were lost in equal measure. Among the hundreds of workers who passed through those gates each morning was a 24-year-old naval architect named Thomas Andrews, nephew of Lord Pirrie, the shipyard's chairman. Andrews had privilege in his blood. His family owned land in County Down. His uncle controlled one of the most powerful shipbuilding companies in the world. His name opened doors that remained closed to ordinary men, but he'd earned respect through his hands and his mind. He knew every rivet, every plate, every measurement of the ships he helped design. He could look at a blueprint and see not just lines on paper, but the living vessel it would become, could predict how it would move through water, how it would handle in storms, where its weaknesses lay. The other architects worked from offices, surrounded by books and instruments, their hands soft and clean. Andrews worked in the yards. He climbed into the half-built hulls, ran his fingers along the welds, asked questions of the riveters and platers. He had a notebook he carried everywhere, bound in brown leather, filled with sketches and calculations in his precise handwriting. Some of the older workers muttered that he was too familiar, that a man of his station shouldn't be getting his hands dirty, that he was setting a bad example. But the younger ones, the ambitious ones, they watched him and learned. They saw that he cared about the ships not as investments or prestige projects, but as living things that would carry human lives across dangerous waters. Belfast in those years was a city of stark contrasts, a place where wealth and poverty lived side by side, separated by invisible but impenetrable walls. The wealthy shipyard owners lived in grand Victorian homes in the hills overlooking the city, houses with multiple stories and manicured gardens, where servants moved silently through carpeted halls, and dinner was served on china that cost more than a worker's annual wage. The workers, Irish, Scottish, and a small but growing population of black sailors and dock workers crowded into narrow brick row houses near the waterfront, buildings that had been constructed quickly and cheaply to house the influx of labor the shipyards demanded. The air tasted of coal smoke and salt, and on certain days when the wind blew from the east, you could smell the rendering plants that processed whale oil for the lamps that still lit most of the city's streets. A thick, cloying odor that settled in your clothes and hair and never quite washed out. The streets near the waterfront were a maze of narrow alleys and courtyards where laundry hung on lines stretched between buildings and children played in the mud. The pubs were always full, men drinking away their wages and their fears, singing songs from the old country, fighting over politics and religion and things that didn't matter. The churches were full too on Sundays, Protestant and Catholic congregations eyeing each other with suspicion across the divide, each convinced of their righteousness, each certain that the other was damned. Joseph Harper was 11 years old that spring, small for his age but wiry and quick, with dark eyes that missed nothing and hands that were always busy. His father, Samuel Harper, had come to Belfast 5 years earlier from Liverpool, following work as a coal trimmer on merchant vessels. Samuel had been born free in Philadelphia in 1855, the son of a man named Elijah Harper, who'd escaped slavery in Maryland through the Underground Railroad in 1847. Elijah had made it to Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to never be owned again. He'd worked on the docks, saved his money, married a free woman named Ruth, and raised his son to be proud and careful in equal measure. Samuel had inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's intelligence. He'd learned to read and write at a Quaker school in Philadelphia, had worked his way up from dock labor to skilled positions on ships. When his wife Mary died of consumption in 1893, leaving him alone with 6-year-old Joseph, Samuel had made a decision. America was changing, but not fast enough. The promise of equality was still just a promise. He'd heard that there was work in Liverpool, that the British ports were hiring, that a skilled man could make a decent living regardless of the color of his skin. It wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough. He'd taken Joseph and crossed the Atlantic, working his passage as a coal trimmer, and settled in Liverpool. But Liverpool had its own problems. Too many workers, not enough jobs, wages that barely covered rent and food. When Samuel heard that Belfast was booming, that Harland and Wolff was hiring anyone who could work, he'd moved again. They'd arrived in Belfast in the winter of 1893, when Joseph was 6 years old and still grieving for his mother. Samuel had found work as a coal trimmer in the shipyard, brutal labor that involved shoveling coal into the furnaces of ships being tested, working in heat that could kill a man, breathing air thick with coal dust that turned your lungs black. But it paid, and it was steady, and Samuel was grateful for it. They lived in a boarding house on Corporation Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Donnelly, who'd lost her husband to a shipyard accident 3 years earlier. The house was narrow and dark, with thin walls and floors that creaked with every step. Joseph and Samuel shared a small room on the second floor, barely large enough for 2 narrow beds and a trunk that held all their possessions. The window looked out onto the street, where you could watch the workers streaming past in the early morning darkness, their faces grey with exhaustion, their lunch pails clanking against their legs. In winter, frost formed on the inside of the window, delicate patterns that Joseph would trace with his finger while his father slept. Joseph couldn't attend the regular schools. There were only 2 in Belfast that would accept a black child, and both were too far from Corporation Street for a boy who needed to work. One was run by Quakers in the north of the city, a 2-hour walk each way, and the other was a charity school near the docks that only operated 3 days a week. Samuel had tried to enroll Joseph in the Quaker school, but the walk was too long and too dangerous. The streets of Belfast were not kind to a black child walking alone. There were gangs of boys who would throw stones, men who would spit and curse, women who would pull their children away as if Joseph carried some contagion. Instead, Joseph spent his days running errands for the shipyard workers, fetching tools, carrying messages, selling newspapers at the gates during shift changes. He was good at it, quick and clever, able to slip through crowds and remember complicated instructions. He made enough coins to contribute to the rent and buy his own food, which made him proud. He knew the rhythms of the yard like he knew his own heartbeat. He knew which foremen were kind and which would cuff you for looking at them wrong. He knew where the dangerous work was happening and where a boy could slip through to watch the massive ships taking shape, their hulls rising like iron mountains from the slipways. He knew that the riveters worked in teams of 4, a heater, a catcher, a holder-on, and a riveter, and that they could drive 200 rivets in a day if the work went well. He knew that the platers measured everything twice because a mistake could mean death when the ship went to sea. He knew that the painters mixed their own colors and that the smell of the paint could make you sick if you breathed it too long. He knew that accidents happened every week. Men falling from scaffolding, being crushed by falling plates, burned by molten metal, drowned when boats capsized during testing. Thomas Andrews was different from most of the managers, and even the workers noticed it. He didn't just review plans from an office. He climbed into the half-built hulls, ran his hands along the welds, asked questions of the riveters and platers. He would spend hours watching a team work, taking notes, asking why they did things a certain way, listening to their answers with genuine interest. He treated them like colleagues, not servants. He remembered their names. When a riveter named O'Brien fell from a scaffold and broke his leg, Andrews visited him at home, brought money for his family, made sure he had a job waiting when he recovered. Some of the older workers muttered that he was too familiar, that a man of his station shouldn't be getting his hands dirty. But the younger ones, the ambitious ones, they watched him and learned. They saw that he cared about the ships not as investments or prestige projects, but as vessels that would carry human lives across dangerous waters. They saw that he argued with the accountants who wanted to cut costs, that he insisted on quality even when it meant delays and expense. They saw that he had nightmares about ships sinking, about design flaws that could kill hundreds of people. Joseph had seen Andrews many times, though they'd never spoken. The architect was just another well-dressed figure moving through the yard, distinguished only by the fact that he seemed to notice things others didn't. A misaligned plate, a rivet that hadn't been properly set, a measurement that was off by inches. Joseph had once heard him arguing with a senior foreman about the thickness of hull plating on a new vessel. Andrews had been insistent, almost angry, his voice rising in a way that made workers stop and stare. "This plating is 2 millimeters thinner than the specifications," Andrews had said, his finger jabbing at the blueprint spread across a makeshift table. 2 millimeters might not seem like much, but at depth, under pressure, it could be the difference between a ship that holds and a ship that ruptures. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Garrett, had scoffed. "Mr. Andrews, with respect, we've built 100 ships with plating this thickness. Not one has had a problem. The accountants are breathing down our necks about costs. 2 millimeters of steel across the entire hull adds up to thousands of pounds in expense." "And how much does a human life cost, Mr. Garrett?" Andrews had asked quietly. "How much is it worth to you?" The foreman had eventually backed down, muttering about impractical idealists and university men who didn't understand the real world. But the plating had been replaced, and the ship had sailed without incident. Joseph had watched the whole exchange from behind a stack of lumber, and he'd thought that Thomas Andrews was either the bravest man in the shipyard or the most foolish. It was April 7th, 1898, a Thursday. Joseph remembered the date because it was his mother's birthday. She would have been 32, would have been alive for 9 years if consumption hadn't hollowed out her lungs and left her gasping for breath in a cold room in Liverpool. His father had been somber that morning, sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands. And Joseph had left early, not wanting to see the grief in Samuel's eyes, not wanting to feel the weight of his own loss pressing down on him. The day was overcast, with a bitter wind coming off Belfast loft that cut through Joseph's thin jacket and made his eyes water. He'd spent the morning selling newspapers at the shipyard gates, shouting headlines about the growing tensions between America and Spain over Cuba, about the mysterious explosion that had sunk the USS Maine in Havana Harbor 2 months earlier, killing 266 American sailors. Remember the Maine. The newspapers screamed, and people were buying them up, eager for news of war, eager for something to break the monotony of their lives. By afternoon, Joseph had made enough coins to buy bread and a bit of cheese from a vendor near the docks, and he'd wandered down to the waterfront to eat, watching the ships. He liked to watch the ships. He liked the way they moved through the water, graceful despite their size, the way their hulls cut through the waves, the way their smokestacks trailed black plumes across the sky. He imagined what it would be like to be on one of those ships, to sail across the ocean to America, to see the places his grandfather had told his father about, the places where a black man could walk down the street without fear. The lough was choppy that day, grey water topped with white foam, the waves slapping against the pilings with a rhythmic thud. Several vessels were anchored offshore, waiting for dock space or repairs, their hulls dark against the lighter grey of the sky. Joseph sat on a piling near the shipyard's private dock, his feet dangling above the water, tearing pieces from his bread and eating slowly to make it last. The cheese was sharp and salty, and he savored each bite, knowing it might be the only substantial food he'd have until his father came home with whatever Mrs. Donnelly was serving for dinner. That's when he heard the shouting. At first, it was just raised voices from the direction of the shipyard's private dock, where smaller boats ferried managers and inspectors out to ships at anchor. Joseph turned and saw a cluster of men in dark coats standing at the dock's edge, pointing at the water. One of them was running back toward the main yard, his coat flapping behind him like the wings of a panicked bird. Something was wrong. Joseph could feel it in the sudden tension in the air, in the way the other workers were stopping what they were doing and turning to look. Joseph jumped down from the piling and ran toward the commotion, his bread forgotten, his heart suddenly pounding. As he got closer, he could see what had happened. A small launch, one of the shipyard's motorboats, maybe 20 feet long with a small steam engine, had capsized about 30 yards from the dock. The boat's hull was visible, dark wood bobbing in the rough water like the back of some great beast. 2 men were clinging to it, shouting for help, their faces pale with cold and fear. A third man was in the water, separate from the boat, his arms flailing, his head going under and coming back up, his mouth open in a soundless scream. The men on the dock were yelling, but no one was moving. Joseph heard fragments of their panic. "Get a rope. Where's the harbor master? Someone fetch a boat. He's going under." But they were just standing there, frozen, watching a man drown 30 yards away. The water was brutally cold. Joseph knew that. His father had told him stories of men who'd fallen into the lough in winter and died within minutes, their bodies pulled under by the cold and the weight of their clothes, their hearts stopping from the shock. The man in the water went under. He came back up, gasping, his arms moving more slowly now, his movements becoming sluggish. Joseph recognized the dark coat, the shape of the man's head, the way he moved. It was Thomas Andrews. Later, people would ask Joseph why he did it. An 11-year-old boy, barely 5 feet tall and weighing maybe 70 pounds, jumping into water that had killed grown men. He never had a good answer. He couldn't explain the impulse that seized him, the certainty that he had to act, that if he didn't act, someone would die. He remembered dropping his remaining bread, remembered kicking off his boots. They were too big for him, hand-me-downs from a boy who'd outgrown them, and they would have dragged him down. He remembered the shock of the cold water closing over his head, so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives, so cold his lungs seized and he couldn't breathe. He remembered thinking that his father would be angry, that this was foolish, that he was going to die. But he also remembered his mother's voice, from years ago when she was still alive and still strong, reading to him from the Bible in their small room in Liverpool. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He'd asked her what it meant, and she'd said that sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice yourself for others, even if they're not your friends, even if they're strangers, because that's what makes us human. The cold was worse than he'd imagined. It felt like knives in his chest, like his lungs were being crushed by an invisible hand, like his heart was going to stop. He couldn't breathe properly. Each gasp brought in more water than air, but he could see Andrews maybe 20 feet away, struggling to stay afloat, his coat billowing around him like dark wings. Joseph swam. He wasn't a strong swimmer. He'd learned in the calmer waters of the Mersey back in Liverpool, paddling in the shallows with other children while their mothers washed clothes on the banks. But he pushed forward, his arms cutting through the waves, his legs kicking frantically. Andrews went under again. Joseph dove, his eyes open in the murky water, and he saw the architect sinking, his coat billowing around him, his arms reaching up toward the surface, his face gray and slack. Joseph grabbed the coat, then Andrews' arm, and pulled. They broke the surface together. Andrews was coughing, choking on seawater, his face gray, his lips blue. His eyes were unfocused, rolling back in his head. "Hold on," Joseph gasped, his own voice sounding strange and distant. "Hold on to me." He got his arm around Andrews' chest, under his arms, and started pulling him back toward the dock. It felt impossible. Andrews was a grown man, easily 160 pounds, and his clothes were soaked, adding another 20 or 30 pounds. Joseph was just a boy, small and thin, and the cold was sapping his strength with every second. His muscles were screaming. The cold was making his fingers numb. He couldn't feel his legs anymore, but he kept swimming, kept pulling, kept moving, because the alternative was letting go, and letting go meant death. The dock seemed impossibly far away. The men were still shouting, but now they were doing something, throwing a rope, running for a boat. Joseph could see Mrs. Donnelly's face in his mind, could see his father's face, could see his mother's grave in Liverpool. He thought about how stupid this was, how he was going to die saving a man who didn't even know his name, a man who would never have jumped in to save him. Hands reached down from the dock. Someone had thrown a rope, and it was floating nearby, a thick hemp rope that looked like salvation. Joseph grabbed it with his free hand, his fingers so numb he could barely feel it, and held on while the men above pulled them in. The rope burned his palm, scraped the skin raw, but he held on. They were moving through the water, slowly, agonizingly slowly, but moving. He remembered being lifted from the water, strong hands grabbing his arms and hauling him up onto the dock like a fish. He remembered being wrapped in a rough blanket that smelled of tar and tobacco, remembered someone pouring something hot and bitter down his throat, whiskey probably, burning all the way down. He remembered Thomas Andrews lying on the dock, coughing up water, his chest heaving, his whole body shaking. And he remembered the silence that fell over the men gathered there. A silence that felt heavy, almost frightened, as if they'd witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. A man in a fine overcoat. Joseph would later learn it was Lord Pirrie himself, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, Andrews' uncle, knelt beside Andrews, his hand on the architect's shoulder. Pirrie's face was pale, his expression a mixture of relief and something else, something darker. He looked at Joseph, then at the other man, and said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "Get them inside. Both of them. And not a word of this to anyone. Do you understand?" Not a word. The men nodded, their faces carefully blank. Joseph was too cold and too exhausted to wonder what it meant. He was lifted again, carried through the shipyard like a sack of grain, and taken to a building he'd never been inside before. The last thing he saw before they carried him through the door was the capsized launch being towed back to the dock, and the two men who'd been clinging to it being helped onto dry land, their faces white with shock. Joseph woke up in a room he didn't recognize. It was warm, blessedly warm, with a fire burning in a small hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. He was lying on a cot, covered with heavy blankets that smelled of mothballs and lavender. His clothes were gone, replaced by a shirt and trousers that were too large for him, the sleeves hanging past his hands, the waist cinched with a piece of rope. His body ached, every muscle sore, and his throat felt raw, as if he'd been screaming. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then it came back. The water, the cold, Andrews sinking beneath the surface, the rope burning his hand. The door opened and a woman in a nurse's uniform entered. She was middle-aged, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She smiled when she saw he was awake, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "There you are," she said, her accent marking her as Belfast-born. "You gave us quite a fright. How do you feel?" "Where am I?" Joseph's voice came out as a croak, barely audible. "Harland and Wolf's medical office. You've been asleep for nearly 6 hours." She poured water from a pitcher into a cup and handed it to him. "Drink slowly. Your body's been through quite an ordeal." The water was cool and clean, the best thing Joseph had ever tasted. He drank it all, then asked, "The man in the water, is he?" "Mr. Andrews is fine. Thanks to you." The nurse's expression became more serious, her smile fading. "You're a very brave boy. Very foolish, but very brave. Do you know you could have died? That water is cold enough to kill a grown man in minutes. A boy your size." She shook her head. "It's a miracle you're alive." "I had to help him," Joseph said simply. "Yes," the nurse said softly. "I suppose you did." Over the next 2 days, Joseph stayed in that small room. The nurse, her name was Mrs. Brennan, and she'd worked at the shipyard for 15 years, treating everything from minor cuts to fatal injuries, brought him food and checked on him regularly. The food was better than anything he'd eaten in months. Hot soup with real meat in it, fresh bread with butter, tea with sugar. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, knowing it wouldn't last. No one else came. Joseph asked about his father, and Mrs. Brennan said that Samuel had been notified, that he'd been told Joseph was safe and would be home soon. But Samuel didn't visit, and Joseph wondered if he wasn't allowed to, if there was some rule about who could enter this part of the shipyard. He spent the time sleeping and thinking, trying to understand what had happened, why the men on the dock had frozen, why Lord Pirrie had looked so frightened. On the 3rd day, his father arrived. Samuel Harper stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at his son, his face a mixture of relief and anger, and something else Joseph couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps, or pride. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled Joseph into a fierce hug, so tight Joseph could barely breathe. "Don't you ever do something like that again," Samuel whispered, his voice rough. "Do you hear me? Don't you ever." "I'm sorry, Papa. You could have died." Samuel pulled back, his hands on Joseph's shoulders, his eyes searching Joseph's face. "That water would have killed you. You can barely swim. What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," Joseph admitted. I had to help him." Samuel's expression softened slightly. "No, it didn't, and you saved a man's life." He paused, then added, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "An important man. They've been asking about you, asking what we need, what they can do for us." That afternoon, Lord Pirrie himself came to the medical office. He was a tall man with a grey beard and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Samuel made in a year. He shook Joseph's hand formally, as if Joseph were an adult, his grip firm and dry, and thanked him for his courage. Then he turned to Samuel and his expression became businesslike. "Mr. Harper, your son did an extraordinary thing. He saved the life of one of our most valuable employees and my nephew. I want to ensure that his bravery is properly recognized." What followed was a conversation that Joseph only partially understood. Pirrie spoke of compensation, of opportunities, of gratitude. Samuel listened carefully, his face unreadable, asking occasional questions in a quiet voice. Finally, Pirrie made his offer, a sum of £50, more money than Samuel made in 6 months of brutal labor in the coal holds, and a position for Joseph aboard one of Harland and Wolf's ships when he came of age, training as a steward, with the possibility of advancement. "It's a good life," Peary said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Steady work, travel, a future. Better than the docks. Better than what most boys like him can hope for." Samuel looked at his son, then back at Peary. "And the other matter?" Peary's expression hardened slightly, his eyes growing cold. "The incident has been recorded as an accident during routine maintenance. Mr. Andrews was inspecting a launch when it capsized due to mechanical failure. He was rescued by shipyard personnel. There will be no public mention of your son's involvement." "Why?" Joseph asked. The adults turned to look at him, surprised that he'd spoken. "Why can't people know?" Peary's smile was thin, not reaching his eyes. "Because, young man, it would raise questions we'd prefer not to answer. Questions about why a senior architect was on that boat without proper safety measures. Questions about the boat's maintenance. Questions that could damage the company's reputation." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And because it would draw attention to you and your father. Not all attention is welcome, especially for—" He trailed off. But the implication was clear. Samuel's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. But he nodded. "We understand." "Good." Peary stood, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. "The money will be delivered to your home tomorrow, and Joseph, when you're ready, when you're old enough, come find me. I'll make sure you have that position." After Peary left, Joseph asked his father, why did he really want it kept quiet? Samuel was silent for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Then he said, his voice heavy with bitterness, "Because powerful men don't like to owe their lives to people like us. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them look weak. And because if people knew that a black boy had to jump in to save a white man, while other white men stood on the dock and did nothing." He shook his head. "It's easier for everyone if it never happened." "But it did happen," Joseph said. "Yes," Samuel agreed. "It did. But that doesn't mean anyone wants to remember it." But it had happened, and Thomas Andrews knew it. Joseph saw Andrews one more time before they left the shipyard. The architect was in his office, a large room with windows overlooking the loft, his arm in a sling, reviewing plans spread across a large table. When Joseph and his father were shown in by a clerk, Andrews stood immediately, wincing slightly at the movement. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Joseph," he said, and Joseph was surprised that Andrews knew his name. "I wanted to thank you properly. What you did—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "I owe you my life. I won't forget that, ever." Joseph nodded, unsure what to say. "What did you say to a man whose life you'd saved? What did you say to a man who was important and powerful when you were just a boy who sold newspapers?" Andrews reached into his desk and pulled out a small object. It was a compass, brass and glass, with intricate engravings on the case, ships and waves and what looked like a family crest. "This was my father's," Andrews said, holding it out. "He gave it to me when I started working in the shipyard. He said it would always point me toward home, no matter how far I traveled. I want you to have it, for when you go to sea." Joseph took the compass carefully. It was heavy, solid, beautiful, the brass warm in his hand. The needle swung and settled, pointing north. "Thank you, sir." "No," Andrews said quietly, his voice intense. "Thank you. I mean it, Joseph. If you ever need anything at all, you come find me. Do you understand? I owe you a debt I can never repay, but I'll try." As they left the office, Joseph looked back once. Andrews was standing at the window, looking out at the ships in the loft, his hand pressed against the glass. He looked, Joseph thought, like a man haunted by something he couldn't quite name, like a man who'd seen his own death and couldn't forget it. The years that followed were quiet ones for Joseph Harper, years that passed in a blur of work and survival. The £50 Peary had given them changed their lives in small but significant ways. Samuel was able to move them to a better boarding house, one with a separate room for Joseph and heat that actually worked in winter, where the walls were thicker and you couldn't hear every conversation in the neighboring rooms. The new boarding house was run by a couple named O'Malley, and they were kinder than Mrs. Donnelly had been, less likely to raise the rent without warning or threaten eviction over minor infractions. Joseph continued his education at one of the charity schools that would accept him, a small building near the docks run by a retired teacher named Mr. Whitfield, who believed that every child deserved to learn, regardless of the color of their skin. Joseph was good with numbers, good with his hands, good at understanding how things worked. He learned to read with increasing skill, devouring every book Mr. Whitfield would lend him, adventure stories, histories, technical manuals about ships and engineering. He learned to write in a clear, precise hand. He learned geography and basic mathematics, enough to navigate and calculate distances and angles. But he never forgot the water, or the weight of Thomas Andrews sinking beneath the surface, or the silence of the men on the dock. Sometimes late at night, he would wake up gasping, convinced he was drowning, his lungs burning with phantom cold. He would lie in the darkness, listening to his father's breathing in the next bed, and wonder if Andrews had nightmares too. He kept the compass Andrews had given him in a small wooden box under his bed, wrapped in a piece of cloth to protect it from scratches. Sometimes late at night he would take it out and hold it, feeling the weight of it, watching the needle swing toward north. He wondered if Andrews thought about that day. He wondered if the architect had nightmares about the cold water closing over his head, about the moment when his strength gave out and he started to sink, about the certainty of death. In 1902, when Joseph was 15 years old and starting to think about his future, about the promise Lord Peary had made, Samuel died. It was sudden, a heart attack while working in the hold of a cargo ship being fitted out. One moment he was shoveling coal into a furnace, his body moving with the practiced rhythm of years of labor, and the next he was on the floor, clutching his chest, his face gray. He was dead before they could get him to the surface, before anyone could fetch a doctor, before Joseph could be summoned from the docks where he was working. Joseph was alone. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. O'Malley, let him stay on for a few weeks out of charity, but eventually she needed the room for paying tenants. Joseph found work where he could, running errands, cleaning stables, loading cargo at the docks, taking any job that would pay enough for food and a place to sleep. He was tall now, nearly 6 feet, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's quick mind. But work was scarce, especially for a black teenager in Belfast. The city was changing. Tensions between Protestant and Catholic workers were rising, erupting into violence with increasing frequency. There were fights, sometimes riots, streets that became battlegrounds over religion and politics, and ancient grudges. Joseph learned to keep his head down, to avoid attention, to move through the city like a ghost, invisible and unthreatening. He slept in a room he shared with 3 other men, all of them dock workers, in a building that should have been condemned years ago. The roof leaked when it rained. The walls were thin enough that you could hear rats moving inside them. The privy was shared by 20 people and never quite clean. But it was shelter, and it was cheap, and Joseph was grateful for it. In the spring of 1903, he remembered Lord Peary's promise. He went to the Harland and Wolff offices, a grand building near the shipyard gates, and asked to see the chairman. The clerk at the desk, a thin man with a pinched face and cold eyes, looked at him with barely concealed contempt and told him to leave. Joseph persisted, explaining about the promise, about the incident in 1898. The clerk laughed, a harsh, mocking sound, and told him that Lord Peary didn't make promises to people like him, that he should stop wasting everyone's time with his lies and delusions. Joseph left, humiliated and angry, his face burning with shame. He'd been foolish to believe the promise would be kept. Powerful men made promises all the time, promises they never intended to honor. Why should he be different? But 2 days later, a man came to his boarding house, one of Pirrie's assistants, a young clerk named Patterson, who looked uncomfortable and apologetic. The man apologized for the clerk's behavior, said that the man had been reprimanded, and told Joseph to report to the White Star Line offices the following Monday. A position had been arranged, just as Lord Pirrie had promised. Joseph would be trained as a steward on the RMS Oceanic, one of White Star Line's premier vessels. That's how Joseph Harper became a steward on the RMS Oceanic, one of White Star Line's premier vessels. He was 16 years old, tall and strong, with his father's work ethic and his mother's intelligence. The work was hard, long hours, demanding passengers, cramped quarters below deck where the crew slept in bunks stacked 3 high. But it was steady, and it paid better than anything he could have found on land. Joseph learned quickly. He learned how to serve meals without being noticed, how to anticipate what passengers needed before they asked, how to navigate the complex hierarchy of ship life, where everyone had a rank and a place. He learned which officers were fair and which were cruel, which passengers would tip generously and which would complain no matter how perfect the service. He learned the rhythms of the sea, the way a ship moved in calm water and in storms, the way the engines throbbed through the hull, the way the smell of salt and coal smoke became as familiar as breathing. He learned how to walk on a deck that pitched and rolled, how to carry a tray of dishes without spilling, how to press a uniform so it looked crisp and professional. He sailed to New York, to Boston, to Philadelphia, the city where his grandfather had found freedom, where his father had been born. He saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the harbor, her torch held high, a symbol of promises that weren't always kept. He saw the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, where immigrants lived 20 to a room, working in sweatshops for pennies. He saw the grand hotels where the first-class passengers stayed, buildings with marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers, where a single night's lodging cost more than Joseph made in a month. He sent money back to Belfast, to Mrs. O'Malley, to pay for his father's grave marker, a simple stone with Samuel's name and dates, nothing fancy but permanent. He saved what he could, keeping his money in a small leather pouch he wore around his neck, never trusting the other crew members not to steal. And sometimes, late at night in his bunk, listening to the snores of the other stewards and the creak of the ship's hull, he would take out the compass and wonder about Thomas Andrews. He'd heard that Andrews had become chief designer at Harland & Wolff, that he was working on ships of unprecedented size and luxury, that his designs were revolutionizing the industry. Joseph wondered if Andrews remembered the boy who'd pulled him from the water. He wondered if the architect ever thought about that April day in 1898, about how close he'd come to dying. In 1909, Joseph heard rumors among the crew about a new ship being built in Belfast. Not just a new ship, the largest ship ever conceived, a vessel so massive it would dwarf everything else on the water. The crew called it the unsinkable ship, though that was more hope than fact, more marketing than reality. Joseph paid attention to these rumors. He'd been at sea for 6 years now, and he'd learned that the sea didn't care about human ambition. He'd seen storms that tore ships apart, seen waves that could snap a mast like a twig, seen ships that were supposed to be safe sink with all hands. The idea of an unsinkable ship seemed like hubris, like tempting fate. But the rumors persisted, growing more detailed with each voyage. The ship would be 882 feet long, they said. It would weigh 46,000 tons. It would have 9 decks and accommodations for over 2,400 passengers and crew. It would have a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a Turkish bath, a grand staircase that would be the most beautiful thing ever built. It would be called Titanic, and it would be the pride of the White Star Line. In 1910, when Joseph was back in Belfast between voyages, he walked down to the shipyard. He hadn't been back since his father's death, hadn't wanted to see the place where Samuel had spent his final years breaking his body for other men's profit. But he was curious about the ship, about this vessel that was supposed to be unsinkable. The ship was there, rising from the slipway like a steel mountain, like something from a dream or a nightmare. It was massive, larger than anything Joseph had ever seen, larger than he'd thought possible. The hull stretched for what seemed like miles, a wall of steel plates riveted together, rising 8 stories above the ground. Thousands of workers swarmed over it like ants, riveting, welding, building, their hammers creating a cacophony that could be heard across the city. Massive cranes lifted steel plates into place, each plate weighing tons. Scaffolding covered the hull like a spider's web. Joseph stood at the fence and watched, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Or perhaps at the sheer audacity of it. Or dread, a cold certainty that something this ambitious, this arrogant, was doomed. He thought about the Greek myths Mr. Whitfield had taught him, about Icarus flying too close to the sun, about the Tower of Babel reaching toward heaven. He thought about hubris and nemesis, about how the gods punished those who reached too high. He asked one of the workers what the ship was called. "Titanic," the man said, not looking away from the hull, his voice filled with pride. "She's going to be the pride of the White Star Line, biggest, fastest, most luxurious ship ever built. They say she's unsinkable." "Who's designing her?" "Thomas Andrews, Lord Pirrie's nephew. Best naval architect in the world, they say. He's been working on her for 3 years, obsessing over every detail. They say he barely sleeps, that he's at the yard from dawn to midnight, checking every rivet, every weld, every measurement." Joseph felt something cold settle in his chest. He looked up at the massive ship, at the thousands of rivets holding it together, at the sheer audacity of it. And he thought about Andrews, about the man who'd almost drowned in Belfast Lough, about the promise of safety that this ship represented. He wondered if Andrews remembered what the water felt like, if he remembered the cold and the darkness and the certainty of death. He wondered if that memory haunted his designs, if every ship he built was an attempt to cheat death, to create something that could withstand anything the sea could throw at it. In early 1912, Joseph received word that he'd been selected for the crew of the Titanic's maiden voyage. It was considered an honor. Only the best stewards were chosen for such a prestigious assignment, men with years of experience and spotless records. The ship would sail from Southampton to New York in April, carrying some of the wealthiest people in the world, millionaires, aristocrats, celebrities. Joseph would be assigned to second-class service, attending to passengers who were prosperous, but not quite rich enough for first class. Businessmen, professionals, families emigrating to America in comfort. He should have been excited. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, the kind of assignment that could lead to permanent positions on the finest ships in the fleet, that could mean better pay and better accommodations. But instead, Joseph felt uneasy. He couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, a whisper in the back of his mind that something was wrong, a cold certainty that he shouldn't go. He almost declined. He thought about telling the White Star Line that he was ill, that he couldn't make the voyage, that they should find someone else. But he needed the money. He was 25 years old now, and he'd been saving for years, planning to eventually settle somewhere. Maybe open a small business, maybe find a wife and start a family. This voyage would pay well, and it would look good on his record. And he was curious. He wanted to see the ship that Thomas Andrews had built. He wanted to see if it was truly as magnificent as everyone claimed. On April 10th, 1912, Joseph boarded the RMS Titanic in Southampton. The ship was even more impressive from the inside than it had been from the docks. The first-class areas were like palaces. Grand staircases with ornate wrought-iron railings and carved wood panels, ornate woodwork that must have cost a fortune, crystal chandeliers that sparkled like stars, carpets so thick you sank into them with every step. The first-class dining saloon was enormous, with tables set with fine china and silver, with waiters in white jackets moving silently between the tables. Even the second-class accommodations were finer than first-class on most other ships. Comfortable cabins with real beds, a dining room with mahogany paneling, a library with leather-bound books. The crew quarters were cramped and plain, but that was expected. Joseph shared a cabin with 3 other stewards, bunks stacked too high, barely enough room to turn around. But it was clean, and it was warm, and it was better than many of the places he'd slept over the years. Joseph settled into his routine. He served meals in the second-class dining saloon, made beds in the cabins, attended to passenger requests, carried luggage, answered questions. The ship was full. Over 2,200 people, passengers and crew combined. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory. People were excited, optimistic. This was the maiden voyage of the greatest ship ever built. What could go wrong? On the second day at sea, Joseph saw Thomas Andrews. The architect was walking through the second-class dining area during the afternoon, his notebook in hand, examining details, making notes. He looked older than Joseph remembered. He would have been 38 now, 14 years since that day in Belfast Lough. But he still had that same intense focus, that same attention to every detail. He was frowning slightly, running his hand along the wood paneling, checking the joints, testing the fixtures. He made a note in his book, then moved on to examine the windows. Joseph stood frozen, his tray of dishes in his hands, watching. For a moment he thought about approaching Andrews, about reminding him of that day 14 years ago, about showing him the compass he still carried. But what would he say? Remember when I saved your life and your uncle paid my family to keep quiet about it? That seemed unlikely to go well. And besides, what was the point? They were different people now, living in different worlds. The architect and the steward, the designer and the servant. Andrews looked up from his notebook. His eyes passed over Joseph without recognition, just another steward in a white jacket, just another servant. Then he moved on, disappearing through the door into the first-class section, and Joseph was left standing there with his tray of dishes, feeling something twist in his chest. Of course, Andrews didn't remember him. Why would he? Joseph had been a child, and Andrews had been in shock, half-drowned, barely conscious. And even if Andrews did remember, what difference would it make? The debt had been paid, £50 and a job. That was the transaction. That was all it had ever been. That night, Joseph couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, listening to the sounds of the ship. The throb of the engines deep and rhythmic, the creaking of the hull as it moved through the water, the distant voices of other crew members, the footsteps of passengers walking on the deck above. He took out the compass Andrews had given him all those years ago. The brass was tarnished now, despite his efforts to keep it polished, but it still worked. The needle still pointed north, steady and true. He thought about his father, about the promise Lord Pirrie had made, about the path that had led him to this moment. And he thought about the water, about how cold it had been, about how Andrews had looked when Joseph pulled him to the surface, grey-faced, gasping, terrified, his eyes wide with the knowledge of how close he'd come to death. Joseph had saved Andrews' life once. He wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, if he would have to do it again. He wondered if that was why he was here, if fate or God or whatever force controlled the universe had brought him to this ship for a reason. The thought was absurd, superstitious, the kind of thing his father would have dismissed. But Joseph couldn't shake it. April 14th, 1912 was a clear, cold night. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally so, like black glass stretching to the horizon, reflecting the stars above. There was no moon, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the lights of the ship. Joseph had finished his evening duties, clearing the tables after dinner, helping passengers to their cabins, answering questions about tomorrow's arrival in New York, and was heading to his bunk when he felt the ship shudder. It wasn't a violent impact, not the crash you'd expect from a collision. Just a strange grinding sensation that ran through the hull, a vibration that lasted maybe 10 seconds and then stopped. The engines stopped too, and the sudden silence was eerie after days of constant throbbing. Joseph stopped in the corridor, listening, feeling the ship's momentum slowly bleeding away. At first, no one seemed particularly concerned. Ships stopped for various reasons. Mechanical checks, navigation adjustments, avoiding other vessels. Joseph went up to the deck to see what was happening, pulling his jacket tight against the cold. Other crew members were there, looking out at the water, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Someone said they'd hit ice. Someone else laughed and said it was nothing, that the ship was unsinkable. that they'd probably just scraped past an iceberg and the captain was being cautious. But Joseph saw the officers' faces, and he knew it wasn't nothing. They were moving with purpose, their expressions grim, speaking in low, urgent voices. Captain Smith was on the bridge, and even from a distance Joseph could see the tension in his posture. Something was very wrong. Within 30 minutes the order came down. All passengers to the boat deck with their lifebelts. The crew was to assist with loading the lifeboats. Joseph helped wake the second-class passengers, knocking on cabin doors, helping them find their lifebelts, canvas vests with cork blocks sewn inside, awkward and uncomfortable, but designed to keep you afloat. Many of them were confused, annoyed at being woken in the middle of the night. Some refused to leave their cabins, insisting that this was an overreaction, that the ship was unsinkable, that they'd rather sleep than stand on a cold deck in the middle of the night. "Please, sir," Joseph said to one man, a businessman from Chicago who was traveling with his wife and daughter. "It's just a precaution. The captain wants everyone on deck." "This is ridiculous," the man said, but he got up grumbling and helped his wife into her lifebelt. On the boat deck, chaos was beginning to take hold. The lifeboats were being uncovered and prepared for launch, their canvas covers removed, the davits swung out over the side. Officers were shouting orders, trying to organize the passengers into groups. Passengers were clustering around the boats, some demanding to board. Others still convinced this was unnecessary, that they'd all be back in their warm cabins within the hour. The ship's band had assembled near the grand staircase and was playing ragtime music, trying to keep the atmosphere calm, their instruments bright and cheerful in the cold night air. Joseph saw Thomas Andrews standing near the bridge, talking urgently with Captain Smith. Andrews' face was ashen, his expression desperate. He was gesturing at the ship, at the water, his voice rising, though Joseph couldn't hear the words. Captain Smith was shaking his head, his face grim. Andrews pulled out his notebook, showed the captain something, pointed at his watch. The captain's expression didn't change, but Joseph saw him sag slightly, as if a great weight had settled on his shoulders. The ship was sinking. Joseph understood that now. He could feel it in the way the deck was beginning to tilt, subtle but unmistakable. Could see it in the way the bow was sitting lower in the water. Could read it in the faces of the officers who knew the truth. The unsinkable ship was going down. He helped load passengers into the lifeboats. Women and children first. That was the order, the tradition of the sea. But there was confusion about who qualified, about what the rules meant. Were second-class women allowed in the boats, or just first class? What about the crew? What about the men? Different officers gave different orders, some strict, some lenient. Some boats launched half-empty because passengers refused to believe the danger, refused to get into a small boat and be lowered into the dark water. Others were so overcrowded they nearly capsized when they hit the water, women and children packed in so tight they could barely move. Joseph worked mechanically, helping people into the boats, untying ropes, following orders, trying not to think about what was happening. Around him, the night was filled with sounds, crying children, shouting men, the groan of the ship's structure as it bent under the strain, the splash of lifeboats hitting the water. The water was rising up the deck now, inch by inch, flooding through the lower decks, filling the cargo holds and the engine rooms. The tilt was becoming more pronounced, making it difficult to walk, making dishes slide off tables and furniture shift. He saw Andrews again, walking through the first-class lounge. The architect was alone now, moving slowly, his hand trailing along the wood paneling, touching the carved details, the light fixtures, the furniture. He looked like a man saying goodbye to something he loved, like a man visiting a grave. Joseph followed him. "Mr. Andrews," Joseph called. Andrews turned, his eyes distant, unfocused, as if he were seeing something far away. "Yes?" "The lifeboats, sir. You should—" "There aren't enough," Andrews said quietly, his voice flat, emotionless. "I designed this ship for 64 lifeboats. 64. It would have been enough for everyone with room to spare, but they cut it to 20. The Board of Trade only required 16, and they said 64 cluttered the deck, ruined the aesthetic, made the ship look unsafe. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. 1,600 people are going to die tonight because someone thought lifeboats were ugly. Joseph stepped closer. Sir, you need to get to a boat. There's still time. Andrews looked at him properly for the first time, his eyes focusing. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or just confusion. Do I know you? Belfast, Joseph said. 1898, Belfast Lough. You fell from a launch. I pulled you out. Andrews stared at him. The color drained from his face, leaving him gray as ash. The boy, he whispered. You're the boy who pulled me out. Joseph Harper. Yes, sir. For a long moment, Andrews said nothing. Then he reached out and gripped Joseph's shoulder, his hand shaking. You saved my life. Yes, sir. And now we're both going to die on a ship I built. Andrews' voice broke, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. This is my fault, all of this. I should have fought harder for the lifeboats. I should have insisted on more safety measures. I should have... The ship lurched, a violent movement that sent them both stumbling. Somewhere below, something gave way with a sound like thunder, like the world breaking apart. The lights flickered, went out, came back on dimmer than before. Andrews steadied himself against the wall, then looked at Joseph with sudden intensity. Go, he said. Get to a lifeboat. Your crew. They'll let you on if there's room. Go now. What about you? I'm staying. Andrews' voice was firm, final. This is my ship, my responsibility, my failure, but you have a chance. Take it. Please, you saved my life once. Let me save yours now. Go. Joseph wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Andrews come with him, that there was still time, that they could both survive. But he could see in the architect's eyes that there was no point. Andrews had made his decision. He was going to go down with his creation, was going to pay for his failure with his life. The compass, Joseph said, pulling it from his pocket. The one you gave me. I still have it. I've carried it for 14 years. Andrews smiled, a sad, broken smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good. That's good. Keep it. Remember me. Remember that I tried to build something beautiful, something safe. Remember that I failed. He pushed Joseph gently toward the door. Go. Live. That's an order. That's the last thing I'll ever ask of you. Live. Joseph went. He ran through the tilting corridors, past passengers who were praying, past crew members who were drinking the last of the ship's liquor, past the band still playing on the deck, their music defiant in the face of death. He reached the boat deck just as the last lifeboat was being prepared for launch. It was Collapsible D, one of the emergency boats, canvas-sided and smaller than the others. An officer was standing guard, only allowing women and children to board, his face set and grim. Please, Joseph said, his breath coming in gasps. I'm crew. I can help row. No men, the officer said, not looking at him. Women and children only. Captain's orders. The ship lurched again, more violently this time. The bow was underwater now. The forward deck completely submerged. The stern was rising out of the sea, the propellers lifting clear of the water, dripping and massive. People were screaming, running, jumping. Some were climbing over the railings, preparing to jump into the water. The band had stopped playing. The lights were flickering, dimming, the generators failing as the water reached them. Joseph looked back at the ship, at the lights still burning in some of the windows, at the hundreds of people still on board, at the massive structure that was breaking apart, its back snapping under the strain. He thought about his father, about his mother, about the life he'd lived, about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He thought about Thomas Andrews, standing alone in the first-class lounge, waiting for the end, accepting his fate. The officer wasn't looking, distracted by a woman who was trying to bring her dog into the lifeboat. Joseph climbed over the railing and lowered himself down the side of the ship, hanging by his hands from the deck above the lifeboat. Below him, the water was black and infinite, impossibly far away. He could see chunks of ice floating past, white against the darkness, like pieces of a shattered moon. He let go. The cold was exactly as he remembered, exactly as it had been 14 years ago in Belfast Lough. It drove the air from his lungs, seized his muscles, sent shocks of pain through every nerve. Joseph surfaced, gasping, and immediately started swimming away from the ship. He'd heard stories of ships creating suction when they sank, pulling everything nearby down with them. He didn't know if it was true, but he wasn't going to take the chance. He swam with all his strength, his arms cutting through the water, his legs kicking frantically, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the dying ship. Around him, the water was full of people. Hundreds of them, all screaming, all dying, their voices creating a sound like nothing Joseph had ever heard, a chorus of agony and terror that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The cold killed quickly. Joseph knew that from Belfast, from his father's stories. 10 minutes, maybe 15, and hypothermia would shut down their bodies, would stop their hearts, would pull them under. He kept swimming, kept moving, knowing that if he stopped he would die. That movement was the only thing keeping him alive. The Titanic's stern rose higher and higher, lifting out of the water at an impossible angle, the propellers fully exposed now, massive bronze blades gleaming in the starlight. The lights went out, plunging everything into darkness. In that darkness, Joseph heard the sound of the ship breaking apart. A deep, grinding roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, the sound of steel tearing, of rivets popping, of a structure that had been built to last forever being destroyed in seconds. Then the stern slipped beneath the surface, and the greatest ship ever built was gone, leaving only wreckage and the dying. Joseph floated in the darkness, surrounded by the screaming. The cold was taking him too, he could feel it. He couldn't feel his legs anymore, couldn't feel his hands. His arms were moving more slowly, his kicks becoming weaker. He thought about letting go, about slipping under the water and letting it end. It would be easy, it would be peaceful. He was so tired, so cold. He'd done his best. He'd lived a good life. He'd saved a man's life once. That was something, that was enough. But then he heard the sound of oars, the splash of wood cutting through water. A lifeboat was moving through the wreckage, picking up survivors. Joseph called out, his voice barely a whisper, barely audible over the screaming. The boat came closer. Hands reached down and pulled him from the water, strong hands that grabbed his arms and hauled him over the gunwale like a fish. He collapsed in the bottom of the boat, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak. He was one of the lucky ones. Out of the 1,517 people who died that night, only 710 survived. Joseph Harper was one of them. Thomas Andrews was not. The RMS Carpathia picked up the survivors the next morning, arriving just after dawn, her crew working frantically to bring the lifeboats alongside and help the survivors aboard. Joseph was wrapped in blankets, given hot coffee that burned his throat, treated for hypothermia by doctors who moved through the survivors with grim efficiency. He survived. But part of him stayed in that water, in that darkness, with the hundreds of people who didn't make it, with Thomas Andrews who'd chosen to go down with his ship. In the weeks and months that followed, the inquiries began. Both the American and British governments held hearings, trying to determine what had gone wrong, who was responsible, how such a disaster could have happened. Joseph testified at the British inquiry, standing before a panel of officials and telling them what he'd seen. He told them about the shortage of lifeboats, about the confusion on the deck, about the officers who wouldn't let men into the boats, even when there was room. He told them about Thomas Andrews, about the architect's last words, about his guilt and his sorrow, about how he'd known the ship was doomed and had accepted his fate. But he didn't tell them about Belfast Lough. He didn't tell them about the boy who'd saved Andrews's life 14 years earlier, about the debt that had never been repaid, about the promise that had brought him to the Titanic. That story stayed locked inside him, a secret he carried alone. The newspapers called him a hero, one of the brave crew members who'd helped passengers into the lifeboats before saving himself. They didn't know that he'd jumped into the water because there was no other choice, that he'd survived by luck and stubbornness and the memory of cold water in Belfast. They didn't know about the compass he still carried, the compass Andrews had given him, the compass that had somehow survived the sinking, still pointing north, still working. Joseph Harper lived until 1964, 52 years after the Titanic sank. He never went to sea again. He settled in New York, in a small apartment in Brooklyn, and found work in a factory that made furniture. It was steady work, honest work that didn't require him to be on the water. He married a woman named Sarah, a teacher from Harlem, and they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. He told his children about the Titanic, about the night the unsinkable ship went down, about the cold water and the screaming and the darkness. But he never told them about Thomas Andrews, about the man he'd saved and couldn't save again. He kept the compass in a drawer in his bedroom, wrapped in the same piece of cloth he'd used in Belfast. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, when the nightmares came and he woke up gasping and convinced he was drowning, he would take it out and hold it, remembering. He would think about Andrews standing in the first-class lounge, saying goodbye to his creation. He would think about the cold water, about the screaming, about the moment when he'd let go of the ship and fallen into darkness. His children asked him once why he kept the compass, what it meant to him. He told them it was a gift from a friend, someone he'd known a long time ago, someone who'd died. He didn't tell them about the debt, about the life saved and the life lost, about the question that haunted him for 52 years. Should he have tried harder to save Andrews? Should he have insisted that the architect come with him? Should he have dragged him to a lifeboat? Should he have refused to leave without him? The official records of the Titanic disaster list Joseph Harper as a second-class steward, survivor age 25. They list Thomas Andrews as chief designer, lost at sea, age 38. The records don't mention Belfast Lough, or the launch that capsized, or the boy who jumped into the freezing water to save a drowning man. Those details were buried by Harland and Wolff, lost to history, forgotten by everyone except Joseph Harper and the Andrews family. But the truth has a way of surfacing, like bodies rising from deep water. In 1985, 73 years after the Titanic sank, Andrews' personal journals were finally released by his family. They'd been kept private for decades, locked in a trunk in the family home in County Down, considered too personal, too painful to share. But Andrews' granddaughter, an elderly woman named Elizabeth who'd never known her grandfather, decided it was time for the truth to be known. Among the journals was an entry dated April 13th, 1912, the day before the Titanic hit the iceberg, the last full day of Andrews' life. In it, he wrote, "Saw the boy today. He's a man now, a steward on this ship. I recognized him immediately. Those same dark eyes, that same quick way of moving. He didn't approach me, and I didn't approach him. But I recognized him. The boy who saved my life in Belfast, Joseph Harper. I wanted to thank him again, to tell him what his courage meant, to tell him that I've thought about that day every single day for 14 years. I wanted to tell him that he gave me 14 more years of life. 14 years to design ships, to fall in love, to marry, to have a daughter, to create something beautiful. I wanted to tell him that I owe him everything. But I couldn't find the words. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps when we reach New York, I'll find him and tell him properly. I'll tell him that he's the bravest person I've ever known. That an 11-year-old boy who couldn't swim jumped into freezing water to save a stranger's life. I'll tell him that I've tried to honor that gift, that I've tried to build ships that are safe, that protect the people who sail on them. I'll tell him that I'm sorry the world didn't recognize what he did, that my uncle paid him to stay silent, that he was denied the recognition he deserved because of the color of his skin. Tomorrow. I'll tell him tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Both men went into the water that night. One survived, one didn't. And the question that haunted Joseph Harper for the rest of his life, the question he never answered, even to himself, even in the privacy of his own thoughts, was whether he should have tried harder to save Thomas Andrews a second time, whether he could have convinced the architect to fight for his life instead of accepting his fate. Whether the debt between them could ever truly be repaid, or whether it was a debt that would echo through generations, unanswered and unanswerable. Joseph Harper died in his sleep in 1964, at the age of 77. His children found the compass in his drawer, along with a newspaper clipping about the Titanic and a photograph of Thomas Andrews that Joseph had cut from a magazine years earlier. They didn't understand the connection, didn't know the story. The compass was sold at an estate sale, bought by a collector who didn't know its history. It's in a museum now, in Belfast, in a display about Harland and Wolff. The placard says it belonged to Thomas Andrews, that it was his father's compass, that it was lost in the Titanic disaster. The placard is wrong. The compass survived because Joseph Harper carried it into the water and brought it back out again, because he kept it for 52 years as a reminder of a debt that could never be repaid. The sea keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you know where to look, if you dig deep enough into archives and journals and family records, you can find the truth beneath the surface. This is one of those stories. A story of courage and debt, of two lives bound together by water and fate, of a boy who saved a man's life and a man who couldn't save the boy in return. A story that asks us to consider what we owe to those who save us, and what price we pay for the ships we build, for the ambitions we pursue, for the promises we make and break. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or is there more hidden beneath the surface? Do you think Andrews should have fought to survive? Or was his decision to go down with his ship the honorable choice? Do you think Joseph should have done more to save him? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.